I now request Dr. Punita, Associate Professor of Economics and Dean of Student Affairs, Stella Maris College, to welcome the gathering.
It's indeed my pleasure to welcome one and all, especially Dr. Rukmini Banerji and Dr. Malati Duraiswamy to this session. I would just like to introduce Dr. Malati Duraiswamy, Professor, Head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. Dr. Malati completed her PhD from the University of Madras. She was the Rockefeller Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow, Economic Growth Center, Yale University. Her research interests include labor economics, economics of human resources, technical education and manpower, gender discrimination, industrial economics, and so on. She has a number of students who have completed their doctorate under her. Dr. Malati has completed a number of sponsored research projects funded by agencies such as the Rockefeller Foundation USA, the UNDP, NCAER, and the Planning Commission, Government of India, ICSSR, Tamil Nadu State DPEP, and SSA, and so on. She has a number of publications to her credit. Her professional membership includes membership of the Institutional Review Board, YRG Care, member of the Senate of NITT, member of Board of Studies in Economics of several institutions, life member of the Indian Econometric Society, member Advisory Board, Center for Data Sharing, Yale University, member of the Academic Council of Mother Teresa Women's University, and so on. It's indeed our pleasure that you are here, ma'am, to chair this session. So, over to you to conduct the session.
Good morning. I thank you very much, and I would like to thank the college for inviting me to chair this session. This session is on challenges to elementary education in India, and the speaker is none else than Dr. Rukmini Banerji of the Pratham Educational Foundation, which she joined in 1996. She has extensive field experience in program implementation in rural and urban areas, as well as in research. Rukmini also led the annual Status of Education report effort for 10 years from 2005 to 14. Now, ACER measures basic learning levels of children in every rural district in India. Now, she's a trained economist. She completed her PhD at the University of Chicago, was also a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. She's now based in New Delhi. Now, I don't want to, I think we are already behind schedule, but to get this talk started, I would like to draw your attention to today's news item, which mentions this is something that the Economic Survey 1718 has to say, that India is going to be growing faster, 7 to 7.5%, but still the focus on education remains a very important area. That's what mentions to, I would just like to quote what it says. It says that India has failed to provide even the basic education necessary for structural transformation. This is reflected in the finding that India, roughly 40 to 50% of rural children in grades 3 to 8 cannot meet the basic learning standards. The failure will prove increasingly costly because the human capital frontier for the new structural transformation will shift further away as technology will increasingly favor skilled human capital. So we see that this remains a very important problem, and thus unless issues in school education, especially in not only enrollment where we seem to have made impressive achievements, but in retention, in progression through school on schedule, and in particularly importantly achievement levels, the learning outcomes. These are things that need to be looked at, and I think Dr. Banerji will have, with her own, as one of the person associated with ACER, have a lot to tell us on how well our elementary education children are doing, what is ailing the school education sector in India, and what is the way forward. I hope this. With these few words, I now invite Dr. Rukmini Banerji to deliver her talk.
Thank you so much. I was sitting here for the first session and couldn't see anybody from behind the podium. So I thought maybe it's better to appear in front to be able to talk to you. Couple of disclaimers before I start. Professor Srinivasan was supposed to speak in this session. That's not me. He's a great man and you'll hear him tomorrow. I'm just filling in for him. So that's my first disclaimer. The second one is that the organizers of the conference asked us many times in the last 6 months to send our presentations so that the chairman of the session or the chairwoman could have a chance to look at it and report. But since you are all students, you'll probably sympathize that I handed in my assignment this morning. Like all good students, I've been thinking about it for the last month or so, but didn't actually get around to completing my assignment till early this morning. So as a result, my chairperson didn't have a chance to see what I'm going to say. This is a tactic that is used very well in many circles, because then whoever has to comment on your work doesn't get a chance to prepare. But that's not the reason I did it. I really didn't finish my work on time. And my last disclaimer is that even though we work in education, we are rarely invited to speak in institutions of higher education. So mostly I spend my time in primary school classrooms. And if this had been a primary school, I would have told all the backbenchers to come in front, because all the front rows are empty and people are sitting in the back. But since you're all very responsible college students, I don't think I should say that. So these are my 3 starting comments. For me, it's a great honor, especially when I looked at all the people who are being invited. Almost everybody is an academic and a very well-known academic. And for us, I am here, a colleague of mine with Pratham is also in the audience, Oliver. For us, it's a great opportunity to present what we do and some of the thoughts we have in actually a more academic setting. And I'm looking forward to some discussions after my initial remarks. Yep, hopefully there'll be time for that. Now, as it turns out that I didn't speak to Shanta, but it follows quite well from what he said. We have policies. Many of our policies have had the best intent, and yet we see that in practice something else happens. And this divide between policy and practice is something that I think plagues many of the social sectors and maybe the non-social sectors as well as in India. And so what I thought I would do in the time that I have here is to think about in what way can research, measurement, data, evidence actually act as a bridge between policy and practice. The ASER report, which is quite well known, has been coming out now almost every year for the last 12 years. We had 1 year gap in between. This year is the 13th year. And 10 years or 12 years in the history of India is not a long time. And so at some level, I'm very encouraged by the changes that we see in our policy environment. Obviously, we'd like much more change to happen. But I thought that giving the backdrop of some of the comments I'm going to say may help us to actually discuss and take forward what Shanta put out, is to say, where do we go from here? So I'm going to talk about 2 aspects of policies, both of which can be traced to the right to compulsory education that was passed in India in 2009. Now, the first point that I wanted to talk about was, at what age should children enter school. It's a very, common sense, everyday kind of thing. And our law says that we have free and compulsory education from the age 6 onwards. And I've been always puzzled about age 6. What is it about age 6 that makes it the right age to enter school? If you look across the world, the age of entry into school actually varies considerably across countries. Now, we are forced in education to bring up Finland for some reason. I think Finland is the size of one neighborhood of Chennai, perhaps. But apparently there, the age of entry to school is a lot higher than it is in many other parts of the world. So I've been interested in this age of entry into school because I think it's a very important point. Everything that happens to you after that is determined by age at which you enter the formal education system. And our law, provides this from age 6. If we move to the next slide, you'll see what the reality is. So one of the things that we do in the ASER survey, in the usual ASER survey, is to ask children from age, or families of children from age 3 upwards, where do they study? Or where are they enrolled? At age 3 you can't really study, but where are they enrolled? Where do they spend their time? And so we have 2 ways in which we can look at this age of entry into school. So if I look at the age distribution of children who are in standard 1, I find that all India, about 1 out of every 5 kids is below 6. But if you look at my states, you see a big range. In states where the preschool provision through the ICDCI system is good, you see a much lower number. Maharashtra, Karnataka have less than 10% kids who are under the age of 6. Then you have states like Rajasthan, where you can say that perhaps the preschool provision is not good, where you have a very large number of kids who are coming into school well before 6. So we have almost 1 out of every 3 kids in Rajasthan who is in standard 1 before what is the legal age of being in school. But then you take 2 other states, Himachal and Tamil Nadu, where preschooling provision is is good. In fact, in Tamil Nadu, it's supposed to be very good. And where you have a proportion of families where both parents have also been to school to be quite high. And there too you find that a very large percentage of children are in grade 1 before the age of 6. We'll go further to look at whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think the reality, despite the law, is that we have large chunks of children who are in school before the stipulated age. In states in the south where birth registration is done more thoroughly, where families, because of institutional births and better birth registration, can report age more precisely, you probably get a clearer picture. But in states like my own home state is Bihar, it's quite common when you go to the household, when you ask the mother or the father how old a child is, they may say the child is, 3, 4 or 5. Now 3, 4 or 5 is fine when you have, for some things. But for the reason that I was asking the question, I think the precision is important. So we may have also the age estimates to be quite varied across the country, with more precision where birth registration and institutional births is high and less so in other parts. So we should always keep this in mind as we look at numbers. There's another way in which the ASER data actually looks at this question of age. If we go to the next slide, and I don't know if you can see this from the back, we ask, as I said, to all families about their children from age 3 upwards. And perhaps we made a mistake by not asking the question before age 5 about whether your kids are in school. And it looks to me like when I look at the patterns of this data that perhaps that's a question that should be asked further, at younger ages as well. So if we compare Maharashtra with Rajasthan, you see that at age 5 in Maharashtra, you have about 59% who are still in Anganwadis, and the remainder you can think of as being in school of some type. The LKG, UKG is really a form of school. Typically, private schools don't take kids in first standard. They take them 2 years earlier. And so the number, something like 20% in LKG or UKG, and another almost 18% are in some kind of school. So in Maharashtra at age 5, you have a substantial number of children, close to half children, who are already in some form of school, who are not in preschool, who are not in a freestanding early childhood center, but already enrolled in some kind of school. If you compare that with Rajasthan, you see the numbers are quite different. Rajasthan, we have less than 10% who are still going to any kind of early childhood center, and almost the remainder, barring about 13% who are in not going anywhere, are already enrolled in school. So we see these very different patterns, and it's interesting to me that there's been no policy discussion on this very important fact of when should you start school, because from standard 1, you're expected to be able to move on some kind of a learning pathway. And if you look at, and I'll talk more about this later, our entire education system, I suspect perhaps even in college, is based on a linear growth year on year, where you're supposed to have mastered whatever you've learned the previous year, and you're building on a new set of things that you have to learn the following year. I think that some of these patterns also underlie what I call that these are some consequences of universalization of elementary education. We've, as a country, spent many years, several decades, in pushing schooling. Now, I think almost every household in the country knows that their children should go to school. And when you're not particularly educated yourself at one end, and at the other end, perhaps you have too much education, if there is anything like that, you tend to want education for your children sooner and sooner. So in the middle class, in the urban middle class, in the urban elite, you see children being enrolled in some form of schooling at age 2.5, age 2. People are worried that their children are going to get left behind if they don't start nursery school, play school, some kind of school. Note the word school is always in those things, early. And I think that in the families which have not had much education, families are seeking opportunities to get them into this mainstream kind of conveyor belt as soon as possible. And some of the patterns that we see in the data, I think, are probably reflecting these trends. A little bit more on this, if we move to the next slide. Recently, Punjab government decided that Punjab is a very interesting state. It has almost 50% of schools of the elementary school age already in private schools. So only half the children go to government schools. And the government, especially the new government that has come in, has been wanting to do a lot of serious things to improve the quality of schooling in the government schools. One of the steps that they have taken this year is to say that they want in every government school a preschool class, whether you call it kindergarten or otherwise. In many states in North India, it's called the Kachi class. Kachi meaning raw, the Kachi class. In Assam, it's called Kosreni, which means, again, some kind of a kindergarten class. This is quite common in school systems around the world, is to have a reception class where kids come into the big school, but they're not as yet in first grade. So I think that this should be welcomed as a progressive move to have this kind of class in your government school. But what we did is we pulled out the data that we had about this age group for Punjab to see that how could it inform what they were trying to do. Interestingly, at the time that Punjab government was discussing quite publicly this provision of a kindergarten in their primary schools, there was a big strike by the Anganwadi workers who felt that this was an incursion into their territory because it is really the ICDCI system who's supposed to be taking care of early childhood up to the age of 6. And so we saw this kind of head-to-head collision of two government departments almost fighting for the same kids. And in that situation, we looked at data to see what does the data tell us about informing the path going forward. And I've pulled some of that here just to help us think about it. So we have children enrolled in government school in Standard 1 and children who are enrolled in private school. ASR is a representative sample of children, so it's a household survey. And one of the reasons to do a household survey was to get a representative sample of all children at these different age groups. And so, even if you can't see the numbers from the back, what you'll see is, number one, a trend over time, and number two, a split of the age group that goes into Standard 1. So, in government schools, you see that roughly about 50% of children are at what I'm calling the right age, and about, depending on which year you look at, anything between 30 to 40% are younger kids who are below 6, who are going into first standard. But the private school graph looks very different. Now, in Punjab, as in private schools everywhere, the private school tends to take children in even rural. This is a rural sample. So these are not fancy private schools. These are just your local village level private schools. Children are taken in almost 2 years before you go to first standard. So you have a lower KG, you have a upper KG. I sometimes feel that children spend many years even before they can get to like a class 3 or a class 4. You already have 8 years of schooling before you reach class 5. And you see this trend. Number one, you see that the proportion of kids who are 6 or older is increasing in the private schools, at the same time that in Punjab, private schooling is increasing. So clearly the downward reach of the private schools into the age distribution is getting stronger. And it's the kids who are going into the government schools are probably now from the lowest end of the entire population distribution. The final slide will perhaps give us some idea, if you go to the next one, about why does this matter. And in ASR, we ask children to read very simple things. You have to read letters, you have to read words, you read simple sentences, and then you read a slightly longer story. If I look just at children in first standard and what they can read, and if I break that up by age group, I think you can see quite clearly here that the kids in Standard 1 in private school, who we now know are considerably older than the kids who are in government school, are doing substantially better. This private school, government school comparisons is something that anybody in education in India has been obsessing about. And I really think that the difference between these two types of kids doesn't come from the school at all. It comes from the parents, because you're a self-selected set of parents who send their children to different kinds of schools. But analysis like this, I think, brings a slightly different angle into it. I think it hints at, and I think more rigorous work needs to be done, that age, you're actually, when you compare children in private schools and government schools, you're comparing apples and oranges, at least in first standard, because these are children of quite different age compositions. And whether the quality of instruction is good or bad, certainly being exposed to school-like things from early on gives you an advantage, at least in this kind of things, that you can see further. So given all of this, there is a proposition to the, I don't know to who you give it, to the CAPE committee or to the parliament or to someone, that the right to education provisions should be now extended downwards into the preschool age group. And I feel like while in principle that is a good idea, some of these kinds of analysis need to inform what should happen. I think if I was asked personally what I would recommend, I would say early childhood development is really important in some kind of a structured, organized way, probably best done in a community setting for the age group 3 and 4, and probably one class, one sort of welcome class into the primary school is a good idea for age 5. But I think the tendency will be, And you can see that in the use of the words, that as soon as you say preschool education should start from 3, you will have very school-like tendencies which will become visible at an even younger age than we see today. If you think about the implications of this, about starting on a journey too early, I think it's common sense. Kids can't run before they can walk. When kids in our own homes learn to walk, there's a lot of support around, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy that is spent in helping, especially the first kid in the family when they start walking. I think from the smiles I can see that everybody remembers some kid or the other in their life. I have 2 kids. I have no memory about my second kid, but I have very clear memories about my first kid learning to walk. And I think that support, that scaffolding, that energizing for children as they start something is really important. By forcing them to run before they can walk, I'm not sure that we will be helping the kids. So the balance between what is a well-designed policy that leaves a lot of room for experimentation versus what is laid down in stone and becomes bad practice immediately, I think is something that, I will go back and rework this in light of what Shanta presented in the morning. But I think that these things fit together. In what ways can the experiences and the evidence of a policy that has rolled out inform the next version of a policy? I mean, policy is not, is not like, I was going to say something which I won't because it may be misinterpreted. I mean, policy is not written by God. It can be changed in Parliament. And I think that those changes need to be informed by more analysis and more systematic look at what the reality is than perhaps that we do. I'll move on to the next example about what the right to education says about teaching and learning. Now, the right to education ensures that we have free schooling, compulsory and free schooling for 8 years, starting from age 6 to age 14. Presumably that correlates with with grade 1 to grade 8. And in the original articulation of the 2009 Act, it talked about a couple of things. First thing was to come to school regularly, but it tells the children to come to school regularly, unlike what Shanta presented, that it should also have a stipulation that the teachers should come to school regularly. The second, it says that you must complete the curriculum. Now, we have curriculums in India which are laid down. Everybody knows that teachers, whether in private schools or in government schools, are very compelled to finish the syllabus because that is really what they are, what the goal of teaching learning is. I don't blame the teachers for this. I think this is what our entire ecosystem in the education system requires. And here it is now enshrined in law, which says that you must complete the curriculum in a timely fashion. The next 2 things say, assess the learning ability of each child and accordingly supplement additional instructions, if any, as required. My grandfather was a lawyer and he taught us to read each line very carefully, because if you read these very carefully, it actually allows you to do a lot more than perhaps we are doing. And finally, it says that you need to hold regular meetings with parents and inform them about the progress that your children are making. These are the provisions for quality education that were there in the original 2009 Act. Subsequent to that, earlier last year, this was modified a little bit, partly I think because of the tremendous pressure on the entire education system for learning outcomes. And it was modified to say that each state needs to specify the learning outcomes at each grade level to follow. And it more or less, in a real sense boils down to, have you finished chapter 17 by October? More or less, I think that's what it boils down to. So let us look at what this, what does the data tell us about the reality of what we see. Couple of really important things. And I think we can't only give credit to the law that came into place. This is, I think, a secular trend that has been happening over the last many years. We see year-on-year rise in enrollment. Now, this is not just rising enrollment in elementary grades. This is the number of children who are reaching 8th standard. 8 years of schooling is what our law says, and let us look at what number of children reach 8 years of schooling. Roughly, if you look at the census 2011, we see that there is 25 million children in each age group in India. So roughly, you have 25 million 5-year-olds, about 25 million 6-year-olds, and so on. And if you look at this data, you can see that about 10-12 years ago, there was about 11-12 million children that reached 8th standard. Today, and the number here is from 14-15, today will be slightly better, that number is close to 25 million. So we are at a historic stage in the history of India, and I'm not sure why we are not celebrating this. We keep saying we are close to universal enrollment. Not only are we close to universal enrollment, we are close to universal completion of elementary stage of schooling as a country, and these are probably the first set of cohorts that are reaching that stage. Kids who are in 8th standard today are the right to education cohort, because they were in 1st standard when the Right to Education Act was passed. So we have a lot to celebrate, because now we can actually find children, or at least find children's names in all our school registers. And depending on the state, we have big variations in attendance in school for children, but there are states where attendance is also very high. In Tamil Nadu, for example, on an average day, you have almost, well above 85% kids who are in school on any given day. But what about learning? Which is the question that I wanted to talk about. There are 2 lines here. The top line is the proportion of students in standard 8 who can actually read a simple story. And the simple story in your own language. I'm not asking you to read in any other language, even though somebody said we should learn another language today. But this is really in your own language. And that line, which is the top line, you can see is relatively flat. Not only is it relatively flat, there is a slight indication of a decline, roughly from about 2000, maybe 10 onwards. The level below that is a math level, and it talks about what is the proportion of children who can do a simple division problem. There's nothing particular about division, it's just of the 4 operations, maybe division is the hardest one. And you typically in Indian schools learn division by in this way, in about 3rd or 4th standard, depending on the state. So we are looking here at learning achievement of 8th standard kids. I'm not saying how far they can go, because many kids go well beyond that and can be at grade level, but we are looking at the bottom. Are all children in 8th standard able to do at least class 3 or class 4 level kinds of tasks? And the answer is, in math about half can, and in reading about 3/4 can. And this is, if it's superimposed, we could put in another graph, excepting I don't know how to put one more thing onto this. If I look at expenditure, you will see that expenditure, government expenditure on elementary education has also been going up over this period of time. If we go to the next slide, this again is at a slightly lower level. If our entire school system is built on completing the curriculum, completing the syllabus, because our assumption is that you come into school at age 6, you finish class 1, age 7 you're in class 2, you finish class 2 stuff, and it's sort of like a linear step ladder going up to class 8. Then let us look at class 3. Class 8 may have been too late. Let's look at what is going on in class 3. And this graph tells you where are children by state in class 3, what percentage of children are close to grade level, based on the assessment that we do in USER. And here too, the one that I've plotted is subtraction. It's very simple subtraction. It's this 2-digit subtraction, which most state textbooks require kids to have learned how to do by class 2. And you can see that we range from Himachal, which is at the top of the entire staircase, Interestingly, and people don't like to see this, Kerala is at number 4 behind Punjab, because our perceptions are that there are certain states in India which are far ahead of anybody. Doesn't matter what the data tells us, because we as Indians have a right to information and we know everything. But it's clear here that actually there are states which are higher than Kerala, and Himachal is one of them. In Himachal, 50% of kids can do this subtraction problem. They can probably do even more. But the interesting part, which I haven't plotted here, is that there is another 25% who are pretty close to being able to do this. So the distribution is skewed in favor of kids being close to grade level. If I look at Uttar Pradesh, which is at the bottom of the curve, and which is, I mean, basically, if Uttar Pradesh does not improve, India will never improve. And so Uttar Pradesh is really important for the health of the nation. You find that less than 10% of kids in Uttar Pradesh are at grade level, which means that 90% of the effort of the school system, of the parents that's going into the state is actually misplaced, because in school or in tuition classes, children are being taught at grade level. But if you have kids who are so far below, and in the Uttar Pradesh case, the distribution of abilities or whatever, of learning levels in grade 3 is highly skewed in the direction of kids not even being able to recognize numbers. In the case of Himachal, another 25% can do addition and probably will learn subtraction very easily. In the case of Uttar Pradesh, a bulk of kids are still dealing with recognizing numbers, but by grade 3, they are being taught operations with 3 digits. So not only does this tell us about how far we've managed to bring our kids, I think all the blank part of the graph tells us about the wasted effort that is going into, the wasted effort in terms of energy and the wasted effort in terms of time and resources that are going to chase certain goals which are clearly not attainable. Oops, we lost the next part of the story. I forget what the next slide was, but I'm very pleased that the economic survey released yesterday has actually picked this up. And not only am I pleased that they picked it up because it's our data, but because I think it really highlights a core capability in the country that needs priority. Another reason to be very happy about why they picked it up is because there usually in the economic survey is a chapter which is it's usually in volume 2. Someone should do an analysis of what chapters come in which part of the economic survey, and the education and health, presumably as well, is always in volume 2 and always towards the end of the economic survey. This graph, which is a little bit difficult, and I think Arvind Subramaniam has made it more complicated than he needed to make it. Basically what it shows, the blue is the reading level, the red is the math level, and I'm not sure which math level he's picked. It looks like he may have picked subtraction or something like that. It shows that for each grade level, so you're going on the x-axis from standard 3 to standard 8, the levels measured in a very basic way are increasing, but they are well below where they really need to be. The 100% line would tell you if kids at these different grade levels have reached grade 2 level competency. But obviously at age grade, that's not where you want to be. You want to be far higher. And if I read the chapter correctly, the 2 dotted lines that he has put up are an attempt to kind of project a grade level learning curve. And the second line is what we think the population of India is going to need, especially as we are moving into things which are going to require much more application, much more critical thinking. So the economic survey ends this chapter by saying that this graph is an example, is an illustration of really the human capital challenge of India. And without really tackling challenges like this and like in health, we are going to be really constrained in terms of the long run development of the country that we see. Okay, so where do we go from here? Because I feel like we need to end with I wanted to give you just 2 or 3 quick glimpses of what we as Pratham do. We bring out this ASAR report every year, but it's not only to bring out a report and talk about it to different forums, but we are also compelled to provide some of the solutions. So this is really the 2016 ASAR survey. If it had to be summarized and presented, this is what we would do. It shows you the different levels at which kids are by grade. And the reason to show this table is a very simple one. India, like all other countries, organizes its school system by age and grade. So really the school system is different rows. If I just put all the 8 rows, that's what your school system would be. And our entire work in the education system is organized by rows. So we do something different for the standard 1, we do something different for standard 3, we do something different for standard 5. So we as people in the education system operate by rows. As Pratham, however, we decided, could we use the same resources, the same children, the same amount of money, the same amount of time in school, but would there be a way of reorganizing this picture to get us far better results and to really get to the solution of this learning crisis? So the method that we follow has different names in different languages. In English, it's called teaching at the right level. So what we do is, if I take grades 3, 4, and 5, and rather than teaching each grade separately, if I teach them by columns. So in any school, if I take kids who are in grades 3, 4, and 5, do the simple ASAR assessment, which gives me these groups, and then I teach the groups of children who are at similar learning level today together. If we do that, what kind of result do we get? I think the next slide will show us what. So this is, again, I'm not sure how far back you can see this. Basically, the green parts of these graphs are kids who are able to read. The dark green is kids who can read things fluently. The light green is when you are able to read paragraphs, and you will probably soon move into being able to read things fluently. So the baseline shows you that there's about 25% kids who at the beginning of this process were able to read. And the end line shows you that almost, above 80% kids are now able to read fluently. And this is done by this grouping at the level rather than by grade. Time taken to do this is government schools, but this data is from about 6,000 government schools in different parts of the country in which this was done. And we see that this kind of change can be brought about by simply reorganizing the existing resources and time in a period of anywhere between 30 to 50 days. Which means 30 to 50 days, if you work at 2 or 3 hours a day, that's like 100 or 150 hours at most. So we feel that the big learning crisis that is now featuring everywhere and is being accepted, there is actually a very easy man-made solution that can be implemented. And if by some mistake somebody made me the education minister of the country, which nobody will, but if they did, then this is what we would do. This, and there could be other methods as well. I think in a period of 2 to 3 years, fundamentally you can teach very large numbers of children to get their basic reading and their basic math in place. And once that foundation is in place, I think a lot more can be done after that. Do I have any more slides? Do you want to go? Okay, so this was it. I think I want to just end with a few other thoughts. This is a big problem, but this is not like HIV, climate change, or any such incredibly complicated problem. I think this problem that we see has solutions which don't require additional resources, but they do require a different way of thinking about things. And we see there are governments, state governments, who are actually adopting some of these methods and seeing pretty good results even when the state government machinery within its own system does it. So this is a very interesting case of where practice is actually outstripping policy. The practical aspects of how to bring about change are being adopted within existing large government systems much faster than the pressure on the policy to be changed. Really, the policy that needs changing here is that we need to rethink what children need to learn at what stage. Frankly, to me, by the time you're 10 or 12, there's plenty of time. Even if we take 5 years to teach children how to read, I don't think you're really missing out on any time. There are many much more sophisticated school systems which take their own time about teaching children. If I ask people, maybe that this is not the right audience, but I sometimes say this, that we all learned algebra or trigonometry in school. But if I ask somebody to solve that here, I don't think they can do it. Does that mean that we've become uneducated, or does that mean that this was something we learned, which I can revive when I need it, but I don't need it all the time? So there needs to be, I think, as the practice moves forward, I think as we see more and more children actually reaching a certain level, perhaps the grade level requirements that we have of India will become possible. But I think at the same time, we really need to think about why do we place these extremely high stringent standards on our children, force our teachers to follow those standards. If I was a teacher, I'd be absent half the time as well, because the task that I'm being given to do, to teach just the top of the class, is kind of a task that doesn't make any sense in my setting. I'm not making excuses for the teachers who don't come, but I would think that the motivation for teaching, and I think that's true at all levels, comes from seeing progress in the students. If you don't see progress in the students, I think there is a demotivation that sets in all across. Parents get disappointed because many parents have sent their kids to school who haven't been to school themselves. So they have high aspirations out of schooling. Teachers get disheartened because they don't see progress in the kids. And the kids, who are the freest birds in all of this, especially in rural areas, are just disinterested and don't come back to school after lunch. And you can see them very productively doing lots of other things outside. And this all makes for a very low level equilibrium, which people are trying to fight to get out of. To me, it looks like if the country had a goal which said by maybe the next elections, all children, at least in grade 5, being able to read, you'd probably see a lot of new energy and a lot of new techniques and a lot of new methods by which people will try to get to the goal. The goal of universal schooling was understood by everyone. And I agree with Shanta when he says that I think big change comes when everyone understands what the objective is. So universal schooling, even the last old lady in the village understands, is when you get up in the morning, comb your hair, take your bag, and you go to that building and come back some hours later. So the definition of schooling has been understood. I think what we need here is a big revolution in making parents, especially illiterate parents, understand what learning is all about. 2 final notes. This year we did a slightly different asar. The report was released about 10 days ago, in which we focused on the age group 14 to 18. And we asked kids to do lots of kind of everyday kinds of tasks. And our attempt was to say that after 8 years of schooling, how ready are children to face everyday life? Everyday life may have work, may have school, may have helping your family. And we find that the foundational skills that you've seen here being low have an effect even on how you operate in everyday life. So that opens a big question about what do we want our kids to learn. The level at which we want them to learn is something that clearly at primary school we need to think about, and the level or the stage by which we want all children to reach that level. But I think as we move higher into middle school and into high school, it's time to really push the button on what is it that we are preparing our kids for. Because if you look at our entire education system, it is geared towards everybody coming to college. But that's not what most children are going to do. And there seems to be very little rethinking about where we want our kids to be so that we can make the most, whether it is out of society or out of the economy or very broadly out of the future that clearly holds lots of new, uncertain and exciting things. So thank you.
I request people to raise their hands be very brief and only one question per person. So about 6 people can ask.
In terms of looking at the same picture from the perspective of demographic dividend and the regional story, if I remember right, the reduction in fertility rate below the replacement level, that's taking place at the western states and southern states, not in Bimaru states. Same way, in the education level also, the higher level of education performance is once again in western states and southern states, not in the Bimaru states. Bimaru states seem to remain wherever they were.
Check.
And am I right or am I missing?
So I would say that in terms of fertility level, of course, you're right. But it isn't the case that there are southern states who are doing a lot better on the learning levels. I think learning levels are pretty flat, and in some cases, in the last couple of years, all data, not just our data, is showing a declining trend. So while the numbers of kids in some of the northern states still continues to be quite high, learning levels across the board are flat, if not falling. Now, and at the same time, I would say the rising aspirations and the fact that we have now free and compulsory schooling is making full cohorts go up to 8. And so I think, to me, especially looking at this year's ASAR results where we focused on the age group beyond compulsory schooling, I think to me it looks like, the historian Ram Guha often says India is a 50% country. And really, are you looking at the glass being half empty or half full? I'd like to look at it in terms of being half full. Because what we see is not only are kids going up to 8th standard, we see a large number of kids in the age group 14 to 18 staying in school, in some kind of school. Not in vocational skilling, but in some kind of school. To me, that's a very convenient thing because you can then access 200 million people in some organized way. If they were to leave school, to be able to get to them would be far more difficult. We also see that by the time you reach 8, the levels of learning are not high, but 75% of kids who get up to there can actually read, which means they can read, they can make up their mind about other things and so on. So it seems to me that there is a big push that needs to be made to ensure foundational skills before these kids completely leave the system. Or a whole bunch of perhaps life skills. For example, they have difficulty in calculating a percentage. They have difficulty in looking at interest rates. They have mobile phones but are not using them for a lot of purposes for what mobile phones could be used for. So while you have the young people still within some kind of an organized setting, I think there could be, and we can see that even with younger children, 100 days, 150 days reaps pretty good results. So we have to get out of this mindset of thinking that I need to do a 5-year course to really change somebody's life and move to more modular ways in which we can work. And I do think that giving some kinds of opportunities which are totally possible today than were earlier. For example, we still have the same examination system that you or I did, which is at a certain day of the year, you go to a certain hall and you look at a certain piece of paper and you write down some answers. Today, I don't think we need to do that. You could have, why can't kids in 10th give exams at any time during that year? Why can't they give it as many times as they want till they do the best that they can? This is done in other parts of the world. I think there are many new possibilities that need to be explored because we do have this very high completion and we do have aspirations which will make children stay inside still. We have kids who at age 14 can read simple English sentences. They can't talk to you in English, but they can understand what you're saying. To me, that is a foundation on which a lot more can be built. I personally feel that spending 5 years teaching people grammar, I was never taught grammar myself, but I think I'm a fairly good communicator, can be done. So there is, the definition of demographic dividend also I think needs to be thought about a little bit more. If I want all of these 200 million or the 25 million each year to come out next year with a wider set of skills, there are things I can still do today. Universalizing secondary education in the way that we've been doing it for the last 10 years may not produce that result. So that's, I don't know if this is it's a long answer to, probably a shorter question.
Good afternoon, ma'am. The Right to Education Act guarantees uninterrupted schooling, which is mainly founded on the no detention policy up to class 8. So, while on one hand we are celebrating the gradual increase in the number of students who are completing the 8th grade, shouldn't we take into account that students are just being promoted without gauging whether they've actually understood what they are being taught in schools? And when they enter the 9th grade, most of them face a shock and they're not able to cope up with the syllabus. So, what are your thoughts regarding this?
So there seem to be a whole bunch of thoughts on this which says hold children back. To me, the one set of blameless people in this whole thing is the kids. If you want to hold people back, we should hold the education minister back, we should hold the principal back. There are many people you can hold back. But I don't see why you need to detain, even the word, no detention policy. Why should I, inflict on these children another set of penalties that are not of their doing? To me, the assessment question is important. If you look at the Right to Education Act, it does say assess children's learning abilities and provide additional inputs or instruction or whatever as needed. So why don't we do that? What is the big deal about holding kids back in classes? To me, by the time you reach 14, you've not even started. So, why would I hold you back and do what to you? Because if I didn't teach you right the first time round, the chances that I will teach you right the second time round are not very high, right? So, I think that we need to look at the Act. The Act also says that give additional help as needed. We're not doing that. Why are we not doing that? Why don't we have a completion assessment that you can take at any time? My 95-year-old grandmother used to live with me, and she had never been to school. She learned to read and so on at home. And one day she asked me where I was going. I was obviously dressed, I was wearing a nice sari and I was going somewhere. And so I said, I'm going to an event where I'm the chief guest. So she wanted to know, she had a very low opinion of me, so she wanted to know what kind of institution would want me as a chief guest. So I said it was National Open School and their annual day. And she asked me, what is this National Open School? So I said, it is for people who haven't been to school. At 95, she wanted to give the NOS exam. She said, finally, there is something for people like me who didn't have an opportunity, but I want a degree. I want to be able to sit for this exam and be able to pass it and say that I too have a degree. So, why can't we have an open set of certification that people at any age can do at whatever time? So, the fixation on this holding children back and penalizing children, I think is completely misplaced. Want to penalize, there are lots of adults to penalize if you feel like it. But I think the productive thing would be to think about how do we support and get people to a certain stage, because that's not that hard. There are people on that side as well. These are very left-oriented people, We should be mindful of the time as well, right? Maybe in Stella Marie's nobody eats lunch.
You covered a lot on the age of entry for preschool, and I was wondering, what are your thoughts on actually ignoring the age aspect? What are your thoughts on what kind of curriculum should be there for preschoolers? Because there's a whole different types of preschool that you said, but they all have the word school in there. An unstructured approach, whereas a structured approach, and how exactly would you think that will affect maybe the learning outcomes or the learning path they're on?
I think that, very quickly, I think that we, again, if you were to ask me, I think we need to have a very simple framework in which you say by the end of second standard, are you able to do this? And you can do much, much more, but at least are you able to do this? By the end of fifth, what can you do? By the end of eighth, what can you do? There could be many methods by which children are taught and many methods by which children are learned. And people should be free to use any of those that they feel. But if there are clear, goalposts that are well understood, not just by policymakers or practitioners, but by parents, then I think this will allow people to hold the providers accountable to, is my child at least able to do this?
So is there some kind of a relationship between school hours and learning outcomes? Because during my interactions with students from the social welfare schools in Telangana, the residential schools, they seem to agree upon the fact that increased school hours, or like the very fact that they were sitting in a school environment, kind of added to their learning outcomes, and even the teacher exposure was increased to a large extent. So is there some kind of a relationship there?
I mean, I'm sure there's, research studies which have been done on this. It probably depends a lot on the quality of the instructional hours and the use of time that probably leads to some of these outcomes. If you look at time use studies in Indian classrooms, you find that a lot of time is wasted or is inactive. So if you have a very active fewer hours, they may be more productive than very inactive many hours. The real waste in India, I feel, is that the school system itself has many constraints, because very often you're part of some bigger centralized structure. But the same pattern is reproduced in all these coaching classes and tuitions and whatnot, which are not bound by any regulator or any curriculum, and actually could be, I'm not proposing that everybody goes to coaching class, but if you're going to supplement the stuff, it could really be a lot more fun than it is. It seems like these private additional components of teaching learning make it even worse than what it needs to be in school. So the second revolution we need to have is we need to federate all these coaching places and have them do totally different things, because perhaps the real dynamism may come from those and move into the regular schools. I think the closer we get to lunch, I'm going to say more and more outrageous things. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Vanshika. I really enjoyed your talk because there are a lot of new ideas in my head. I'd like to quote a song, we don't need no classroom control, teachers leave them kids alone. So this idea is constantly in my head, where we all believe and we all understand that the objectives of the Indian education system have been stagnant, and we've not grown past that. And what is it going to take for people to sit up and take notice and actually foster thinking and ideas? I know Pratham does a lot of work around this. So can you tell me a little bit more about the psychology behind it, and what will it take, and what we can do as students who feel agitated and who feel the need to give back and try to help others learn as well?
It's a big question. I think number one is, I think there needs to be a much more widespread belief of the kind that I think all your families have. Your families all believe that every one of the children in my family can learn. And if they didn't believe that, you all would not be here. I think this belief needs to permeate through and through. We've achieved schooling for all, and therefore learning for all should be very easily possible. There are mindset issues, I think, in achieving that. But I think as young people, Pratham has 6,000 full-time young people, many of whom are not particularly well educated themselves. But they have the belief that single-handedly they can change the village. And in the village, the people they can really change are the kids who everybody has given up on. Because you can't give up on anyone before you reach at least age 30, I feel. Or maybe 50, I don't know. But at age 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, I mean, except for maybe a 5% who really has some kind of a learning disability, I think every kid can learn. And when young people come into a community and prove that, I think that changes everybody's minds a lot. So I think every kid can certainly learn to read, they can learn to enjoy stories, they can write their own. I think these are, completely possible, and it just needs some pressures, not some pressures, I think it needs some encouragement from those who are a little bit ahead to do that. I just want to finish off, because I know this should be the last one, that in the work that we do, we often find that we have to unlearn a lot of things. And I'll give you an example. The founder of Pratham, Madhav Chavan, he often says this. He says that children are not learning, but they're really smart. Now, you can see that. You can see that in your home, you can see that in the street, that, the kid is able to get a lot of things done on their own using their own devices. Are we using that capability of kids to really channel it into this kind of work? We've recently started working or experimenting, I would say, with what do kids do with digital technology. And I'm not for once saying that it is technology is going to change things. But what has happened is that our interaction with kids, with technology, has taught us to look at this whole business of teaching and learning in a slightly different way. So, EdTech, which is a big buzzword, and lots of people are doing startups in EdTech and whatnot, to me has an assumption that I will do the content and I will give it to the kid, and the kid will look at this content and then it will be changed in some way forever. So that's kind of the assumption on which a lot, and that, best if this happens inside the school, because the teacher is useless. So if I give tablets to everybody, or I give computers, then, and give them the right content and engaging content, it'll all be fine. We see exactly the reverse. Number one, we have been now playing with some very large number of tablets, about 10,000 tablets, which we've given to kids themselves in villages. So, nothing to do with school. I'm not going to give it to an individual kid, but groups of 5 or 6 kids, here's the tablet, and you're responsible for the tablet. This in itself was a big step for a lot of us. Will the tablet come back? What if it's, harmed? What if it breaks? What if it's stolen? Big learning from these 10,000 tablets was not even 5% was lost or broken or destroyed or stolen. So kids take very good care of things that they find of value. I've been in villages in UP, for example, where the tablet is kept in the evening with all the gods' pictures. And in the morning, the mother puts a tika on everyone. So the tablet also gets a tika on it. Now, if you're going to treat your tablet like that, it's very unlikely that anything bad is going to happen to the tablet. Number two, because these kids had to share the tablet, they learned a lot about working with each other. The tablet was just an excuse. The rest of the stuff they did was actually, it fostered a group work. And the third very important thing that we learned is, when kids go to school, maybe it's the wall, maybe it's the textbook, mom feels, especially illiterate mom feels, and I'm very, pro-moms, I have nothing against dads, but I just feel a little bit more akin to moms, that more, that's the school's business. This learning business is a school's business. I'm illiterate, so how can I engage? The fact of this tablet, partly the tablet, has audio and video in it, mom doesn't feel the distance. I've been in situations where there was a science experiment which was on a video in the tab, and the kids were trying to show me that science experiment, and it was some magnet and it was supposed to float, but it sank. And this again was in a village in UP, where the aunt or the grandmother, she had her, ghungat, she lifted it up and she said, "Move, you kids. I don't know what you people learn," and she did the experiment for me. And then she said, as she was doing the experiment, I didn't even know that I actually knew, but I sit with the kids when they do it. And so she learned in a way that somehow the textbook and the school walls were a barrier for a woman like this to engage with the children around her. And the final most interesting thing, and I wish I could show you this video, maybe I can send it, is that what we hadn't realized is these tablets have obviously cameras in them. So number one, as soon as the tablets were given to the kids, they started exploring all sorts of things. No matter what password, what code you put on it, they broke it right away. So they knew how to get into it if they wanted to get into it. And secondly, we thought we were going to give them videos that they watched. Very soon we find that they are making videos that they are giving to us. So this is in this whole teaching learning business, I find that currently with this new experiment, the tablet just happens to be a means that we are learning a lot more from what the kids are doing and what the kids are doing in groups and how they are interacting. We have thousands of videos made by these children about their village. And to me, it's a reverse kind of wiki effort in which perhaps the social studies curriculum should be a whole bunch of videos like this rather than a small group of a few people writing a textbook and telling you what to do. So I think that the point behind my telling you all this is I think we need to really experiment out of the box. And as Pratham, we see that those wide open spaces are actually outside the school. I think you need to go to school. There's no question about that. Because there are many things about school, even if you don't learn, that are really valuable. But there is also a vast space outside school which really needs to be explored and understood, and group dynamics of kids, how can those be fostered? Because I think these are the skills that kids are going to need to have. I mean, you could not have pulled off this conference by 2 people working alone. You needed a whole team to be doing a bunch of different things. That's not part of any curriculum in this college, but it's clearly a value that the whole establishment is nurturing. And why can't we do that with the kids that we see outside?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Rukmini Banerji for taking time off her busy schedule and delivering an enlightening lecture on the challenges of elementary education in India. This lecture has widened our horizon on the subject of elementary education in India and taught us the importance of bridging the gap between policies and practices, and focusing on the importance of making children attend pre-primary school to give them a solid foundation in the field of learning. We'd also like to express our heartfelt gratitude to the chairperson, Dr. Malti Duraisamy, for chairing this session. We'd like to thank the rapporteurs, Nivedita and Padmaja, for their presence. We'd like to thank the audience for being attentive and interactive throughout the session. Last but not the least, we would like to thank Sister Hilda and her team for their technical support.